Hi there everyone, welcome to today's coffee break webinar. My name is Jonathan Mudrick and I'm a product specialist with Exactal. Today's topic is import workbook from Excel. For those attendees whom are new to watching these webinar videos or simply just new to CostX, I'd like to quickly introduce you to CostX. So what is CostX? It is a digital estimating software package with universal application ranging from hand-drawn sketches, PDFs, 2D and 3D CAD files, as well as 3D BIM models, which incorporate on-screen measurement, live-linked workbooks, revisioning capability, and BIM data extraction. In the last webinar we posted, we covered the topic of coding and code sorting. In that webinar, we covered the following topics. What are code libraries used for? Inserting a code library, editing a code library, importing a code library from CSV, dragging codes into workbooks, and generating a workbook grouped by code. If you'd like to view that webinar or any other webinars that we have recorded, please hop onto our website using the link shown up on the screen. This month's webinar, Import Workbook from Excel, we will kick off with a few benefits of importing a workbook from Excel. First, and probably one of the most obvious ones, is that there's no copy and paste required. Then, a speedy setup of unpriced bill of quantities. And finally, it's easy to build workbook templates by simply importing existing data from an Excel spreadsheet into a Caustics Workbook. Next is the process or workflow to import a workbook or spreadsheet into a Caustics Workbook. We'll start by adjusting data in Excel. This depends on the format of the Excel document. In some scenarios, this might not be required, and therefore this step of the process is optional, depending on the scenario. Then we load the import in CostX. Once we have loaded the import file into CostX, we can configure the import preview it and then configure the required columns as well. Finally, we can import it into a CostX workbook. I'll work through 4 options showing you how one might handle different scenarios, and these 4 options will entail import based on formatting in the Excel spreadsheet, then import based on a control column, which we'll create in the Excel spreadsheet. Import based on Excel worksheet tabs. And then finally, I'll work through an example of the combination of all of the above. So without further ado, I'll jump across to CostX. Switching over to a live demonstration, we'll work through and demonstrate the first option of importing based on formatting. Working through the process that we previously covered in the PowerPoint slides, the first step is to adjust the data in Excel. This is, however, an optional step. In some scenarios, the Excel file might not need any adjustments. The reason for possible adjustments is that a Caustics workbook is based on a hierarchy type structure made up of different levels, whereas Excel spreadsheets typically display all the data on one or multiple sheets and not levels. Looking at this Excel file, we can see that we have our summary trade heading in bold and capitals, and all the detail items beneath it in non-bold text. In a Caustics workbook, we would typically have demolitions at level 1 of the workbook, and all the items included in the demolitions trade listed at level 2 of the workbook beneath the heading. When importing a workbook from Excel, we can tell Caustics that if there's an item or description with bold and capital text formatting, then treat it as a level 1 summary item. This means that this Excel file wouldn't require any adjustments prior to importing, as all the bold and capital text will appear at level 1 of the new workbook, and all the text that does not match the bold and capital text formatting can then be placed at level 2 of the workbook. We can therefore open up Caustics and move on to the next step of the process, which is loading the spreadsheet into import. To do this, we'd need to open up the Workbooks ribbon tab all the way at the top, and then click on the lower half of the Add button. We would then need to select the Import Workbook from Excel option from the drop-down list. The File Explorer will open, allowing us to locate and select the saved Excel file, which we were previously looking at, this one over here, which is the import based on formatting. The Import Workbook from Excel dialog window appears, allowing us to move on to the next step of the process, which is configuring the import. We'll start by renaming the workbook. I'll just keep it the same name, but maybe annotate this with level 2. Moving down the dialog, we can leave the CostX checkbox ticked, as there is only one Excel worksheet tab in the spreadsheet over here called CostX. We'll leave the import control column field blank for now, and we'll revert back to this later on. We then need to specify which column in the original Excel file is the description column. So here we can see it's column B. Therefore, in the description column field, we'll click on the down arrow and select column B. We'll leave the blank rows field set to import blank rows. That just means that it will include the blank rows between the items. We'll also leave the skip rows containing text checkbox unticked for now. Then the level tabs represent each level of the new Caustics workbook. The radio buttons and checkboxes beneath this represent the current Excel spreadsheet formatting. This therefore allows us to map the settings for each level of the workbook based on the formatting from the existing Excel spreadsheet. So, in our specific example to the left-hand side, the Excel spreadsheet, we'll need to place a tick in the Match from Formatting checkbox and turn the radio button on for both bold and capital letters, as this is the formatting that has been applied in our existing Excel spreadsheet for all of the summary headings like demolition and groundworks. Once all of the settings have been applied, we can then click on the Preview button. This switches over to the Preview tab at the top of the window, where it gives us a preview of the hierarchy structure that will end up being implemented in the new Caustics workbook. This hierarchy can be expanded and collapsed using these plus and minus buttons against the higher levels. To make it even easier, we could right-click over the column head over here and select Collapse All, or right-click and select Expand All. Next, we need to map this quantity, unit and rate data from the Excel spreadsheet to the required columns in a Caustics workbook. Over here, you'll notice that it says right-click to select the workbook column for the data to be imported. Therefore, we can right-click the column header above all of the quantities and map this column to the quantity column in a Caustics workbook. This makes it very easy to map the Excel spreadsheet columns to a Caustics workbook column without having to manipulate the existing Excel spreadsheet before the import process. We'll do the same for the unit column as well as the rate column. We won't map the total column. Instead, we'll let the Caustics workbook generate its own total formulas as it typically would. Note that at any stage the settings don't provide the desired preview. We can always switch back to the Import Settings tab to make any amendments if required. When switching back to the Preview tab, we'll generate a new preview and notice how it's remembering the previous settings and mapping of the columns, as you can see over here. Now that the preview is in the desired format, we can then move on to the final step of the process and click on the Import button. The spreadsheet is very quickly and easily imported into a Caustics workbook. Please note the formatting from the original Excel spreadsheet is maintained, and we're drilling down on the subtotal of, say, groundworks. We can see all the items that weren't bold or capitals in the original Excel spreadsheet now appear at level 2 of the workbook, also maintaining their formatting from the original Excel spreadsheet. Let's say we want to rather import the data into the workbook to form a 3-level workbook instead, so that these 3 base foundation items appear at level 3 of the workbook beneath the isolated base foundations heading, which will appear at level 2 instead. To do this, we'll click on the lower half of the Add button and select Import Workbook from Excel. We'll select the same spreadsheet which we had previously used. And when the Import Workbook from Excel dialog appears, notice how all the settings from the previous import have been remembered and saved. This time, however, we would like to import a 3-level deep workbook, ensuring that the underlined text from the original Excel spreadsheet appears at level 2 of the workbook and the items down at level 3. To do this, we'll select the level 2 tab in the Caustics Import Workbook from Excel window, place a tick in the Match from Formatting checkbox, and then set the Underline Radio checkbox to True, meaning if there's any underlined text in the Excel spreadsheet, then treat it as level 2 heading. We can then rename the file to 3 levels or level 3 and click on the Preview button. Notice the column mapping settings have been maintained, and also notice that the hierarchy is in a 3-level deep structure. We can therefore click on the Import button. This time when drilling down on the groundworks trade, the text that is underlined is placed at level 2 of the workbook, and then when drilling down, say on the isolated base foundations item or heading, the plain item text is at level 3 of the workbook. So it's the exact same spreadsheet, original Excel spreadsheet, that has been imported using 2 different formatting settings. Moving on to the next option of importing a workbook from Excel, which is based on a control column. There may be a scenario or an instance where we might receive an Excel spreadsheet and the formatting might not always suit the desired layout. For example, here I've opened up a different Excel spreadsheet with a 3-level hierarchy structure, but the level 1 and the level 2 headings both have the exact same formatting of bold, capitals and underline. The previous method wouldn't work in this instance because the formatting cannot differentiate between the 2 different levels. Therefore, in some cases, it would be a lot easier to manage the data using a control column, such as this one over here. Here you can see how we can assign numbers to the rows of data. For example, groundworks would need to be at level 1 heading in the workbook. Site clearance would need to be a level 2 heading in the workbook, and the clear site item would need to be at level 3 of the workbook. You can continue assigning different levels to the items in the original Excel spreadsheet, like so. Please note that Excel intelligence such as filters or formulas, etc., can be used in combination to make this process a lot quicker. Once the control column is complete, we can then revert back to CostX, click on the lower half of the Add button, and select Import Workbook from Excel. We'll select and open up the Excel spreadsheet that we currently have open up on the left-hand side, which is import based on control column, and click on Open. Looking at the Import Workbook from Excel dialog, moving from top to bottom, I'll leave the name with the default name. Obviously, it can be retyped if you needed to. Excel worksheet tabs, there is only one tab over here called CostX, so I'll leave that checkbox ticked. And then this is where we can now implement the field of Import Control Column. We'll click on the down arrow and we'll need to specify which column is the control column. In this case, it's column G, so we'll select column G from the drop-down list. We'll need to set the description column as well, which is column B, as you can see over there. And we'll leave all the other settings as we aren't using the formatting options this time around. Instead, we're just simply using the control column feature. So we'll click on Preview. And notice the 3-level hierarchy structure based on the numbers that we've assigned to each of the items in the original Excel spreadsheet. We can then select the workbook columns for the data to be imported to. So that will be the quantity column. This will be the unit column. So just right clicking on the column header, and this column will be need to be mapped to the rate column in a CostX workbook. And then we can click on the Import button to import the workbook using the control column instead of using formatting. After reviewing the import, we can see how easy the control column makes it for us to assign data to the relevant level in a Caustics workbook. Moving on to the third option, or the third scenario, I'll just open up a Excel spreadsheet over here, a slightly different one. The third option is importing a workbook from Excel based on Excel Worksheet tabs. In some scenarios, we may receive an Excel spreadsheet where there is a summary tab, just like this one over here, and then a tab for each trade or section of the works. In this example, we can see a tab for each trade package, which links up to the summary sheet over here, or summary tab. In a scenario like this, we can open up CostX, click on the lower half of the Add button, and select Import Workbook from Excel. We'll select the required Excel spreadsheet, which is the third one over here. And once again, we've got the Import Workbook from Excel dialog that appears. Moving down the dialog window, I'll just leave the name as the default name. Here we've got the Excel Worksheet tabs to be included as part of the import. Here we can place a tick against all the tabs we would like to import, and also choosing which tabs we don't wish to import, like the summary tab. We can then select column B for the description column. And then on the level 1 tab, we can simply just select Use Worksheet Tabs, which assigns the worksheet tab name as the level 1 heading in the Caustics workbook. So before clicking the preview button, the expected preview would have demolition as level 1, and all the items on the demolition tab would then appear at level 2 of the workbook. Groundworks would be level 1, piling would be level 1, and so on and so forth. So to preview the output, we'll click on preview, and as expected, we've got demolition level 1, groundworks level 1, and all the other items at level 2 of the Caustics workbook. We can now select the workbook column data to be imported, such as the quantity column. We also want to bring in the unit column, and we'll assign this column to the rate column in the Caustics workbook. And then click on the import button. So as expected, this time it's used the tab names from the original Excel file of demolition and groundworks, assigned it to level 1, and if we had to drill down on the subtotal in the new Caustics workbook for groundworks, notice how it matches the tab in the original Excel spreadsheet. Moving on to the fourth and final option, which is probably the most common option, and that is a combination of all the previous methods or scenarios that we've just worked through. To illustrate this, I'll open up a Excel spreadsheet, which has a slightly different format to what we've seen previously. Here we have an unpriced bill of quantities. A few things to note. In this example, the bills of quantities have multiple cover sheets. So here we've got a cover sheet, and there's a cover sheet. It's also got collection sheets. as well as a few summary sheets at the end of the Excel spreadsheet, all of which will need to be excluded from the import process. Furthermore, you'll also see that we have headers and footers in the Excel spreadsheet, which will also need to be excluded from the import process. When scrolling down this sheet, you'll notice how the header is also being repeated. Which means every time the header and footer is repeated, we need to exclude each of them. Looking at this text over here, we can see that this text is being repeated. We've got a header that says continued and a second level header that also says continued, which is just continuing on from the previous sheet above that. Again, we'd like to exclude both of these headers from the import process. And looking at the bottom of the spreadsheet, we can see we have multiple tabs, some of which will need to be excluded from the import process. I've gone ahead and partially completed this spreadsheet using a control column out to the right hand side over here. But looking at this second sheet, we've got some work to do against each of the relevant items to complete it. Therefore, starting with the header, if you want to exclude an entire row from the import, we can use the letter X in the control column to remove it. Therefore, we can just type X against each of the header items, either typing it in, copying and pasting, or duplicating the X down against all the items. Next, looking at this continued text annotated to the heading, we could utilize the X in the control column. However, there's a quicker method using the CostX configuration window later down the track, so we can ignore this for now. We can, however, utilize the control column for the items beneath this heading by assigning 3 against each item, telling CostX that these items belong at level 3 of the new Caustics Workbook. Finally, for the footer, we can simply use the control column to exclude the footer from the import process by using the X. Please note that once again, Excel intelligence such as filters, sorting, macros, etc. can be used to help speed up this spreadsheet manipulation process. Once complete, we can then revert back to CostX, click on the lower half of the Add button and select Import Workbook from Excel. I'll then select the workbook that we've been working on and click on Open. And then looking at the Import Workbook from Excel window, we'll start working from top to bottom. I'll leave the name with the default name. Looking at the Excel worksheet tabs, this is where we'd need to work through the list and select the corresponding tabs that we'd like to import, leaving the tabs that we wouldn't like to import unticked. Looking at the original Excel spreadsheet, we can see that column I is the column that we've used for the control column. Therefore, in the input control column field, click on the down arrow and select I as the control column. Looking at the original Excel spreadsheet, column C is the description column, so we'll choose that from the drop-down list. Again, looking at the original Excel spreadsheet, because there are many blank rows in the Excel spreadsheet, we can change this over here where it says blank rows field. Click on that drop-down arrow and select skip blank rows, which will therefore leave the blank rows out of the import process. Then, coming back to the heading that had the continued text in it, we'd like to remove these rows with that text in it. Therefore, we can use this checkbox over here called Skip Rows Containing Text. We'll place a tick in that checkbox, and we need to specify the text that we don't want to include as part of the import process, and it needs to match the exact same text from the Excel spreadsheet. Therefore, I'll just change this to how it's been spelt within the Excel spreadsheet, and it is not case sensitive. Once all of these settings are in place and they correlate to the Excel spreadsheet, we can then click on the preview button, which opens up the preview, where we can review if the settings have been set correctly and check if the output is correct, bearing in mind that it can always be updated or changed before clicking on the import button. To do a high-level quick check, I'll just collapse all by right-clicking the column header and selecting collapse all, just to ensure that my level 1 is in the desired structure. I'll then expand the pipe work level 1 item or summary item, as well as the subheading for stormwater drainage. Scrolling to the right hand side, we'll then need to select the workbook column for the unit and the quantity column. By assigning them accordingly. And finally, we can then click on the import button. Here we have an unpriced bill of quantities that has been imported from a relatively complex Excel file using multiple different import settings in combination with one another. And that draws an end to the webinar. Hopefully this webinar has given you more insight on how to import a workbook from Excel, and hopefully it helps you save time in doing so. Thank you very much for watching the webinar. If you'd like to contact myself or any of my team members, please feel free to contact us using the details up on the screen. And if you'd like to view the recording of this webinar or any of the others, please feel free to visit our website as shown up on the screen. Thank you very much again, and look forward to seeing you at the next one. Cheers.